In 1933, in the hills of eastern Kentucky, a coal miner's family could wake before dawn to a kitchen already cold, already smoky, and already short on nearly everything. The Great Depression had pushed unemployment in the United States to roughly 1 in 4 workers, and in parts of Appalachia. Coal towns did not merely lose wages, they lost credit, food, heat, and the company store system that had trapped families long before Wall Street collapsed. A sack of flour might have to last a week. A few spoonfuls of lard might have to flavour an entire meal. And yet, on a black iron stove, something warm could still appear. Biscuits and gravy. That sounds ordinary now, because you can find it on a diner menu or under a heat lamp beside a highway exit for a few dollars. But the dish began as something far more serious than comfort food. It was calories. It was thrift. It was a way to turn flour dust, pan drippings, salt, pepper, and milk into the difference between leaving home hungry and leaving home able to work. So how did a plate of soft biscuits covered in pale gravy go from poor people's survival food to one of the most beloved breakfasts in America? How did scarcity become nostalgia? And how did a meal built from scraps become a symbol of abundance? That was the 1930s, but the story of biscuits and gravy begins much earlier, before diners, before truck stops, before the South. It begins with grain, fire, and hunger, thousands of years ago. When human beings first learned that crushed seeds mixed with water could be made into something that lasted, you have to start with hunger, because hunger is the real architect here. Not a chef, not a cookbook or author. Hunger in the mountain south, the lower Mississippi Valley, the Carolina backcountry, and the worn-out farms scattered across the old cotton belt. Breakfast was not leisurely. Breakfast was fuel for work that began before sunrise and ended when the light disappeared. Think about the world this dish came from. You might be a tenant farmer in Georgia, a mill worker in North Carolina, a sharecropper in Alabama, or a railroad hand in Tennessee. Your day might begin in a one-room cabin where smoke drifted through gaps in the boards, and where actual money was almost never in the room. The economy was not abstract. It was visible in the pantry. A little flour, a little fat, maybe milk. That was it. And here is the strange thing. Those 3 ingredients could become something that felt generous. Flour gave body, fat gave tenderness, milk gave softness, heat made the biscuit rise, or at least puff enough to seem lighter than it was. The gravy did the rest, stretching whatever pork flavour remained in the skillet across the whole plate. This was edible arithmetic. 1 spoonful of grease became a pan of gravy. 1 handful of flour became a tray of biscuits. 1 small breakfast became labour for 6, 8, 10 hours. Think about that for a second. In a world without reliable wages, refrigeration, supermarkets, or social safety nets. A food's greatness was not measured by elegance. It was measured by whether it could be made from what was already there. Biscuits and gravy passed that test perfectly. It required no rare spices, no expensive cuts of meat, no imported ingredients, and no delicate timing that only a trained cook could master. It belonged to kitchens where the cook was tired, where nothing could be wasted, and where the same skillet might cook breakfast, dinner, and supper. That is why the dish is sometimes described as humble, but humble is almost too polite. It was poor food. Bluntly, it came from people, often women, expected to perform a daily miracle with almost nothing. Somebody had to render the lard, save the drippings, judge the heat, mix the dough, and feed everyone before the day swallowed them. This was not convenience. It was skill under pressure. And if the scene feels peaceful from a distance, look closer. Poverty has a texture. It smells like damp wool, wood smoke, sour milk, and yesterday's grease warming again in the skillet. It sounds like a spoon scraping the last flour from the bin, like a child coughing in the corner, like boots on a floor that is too cold. It feels like calculation. How much can you use today without ruining tomorrow? That calculation made biscuits and gravy possible. Here is the detail that matters. Biscuits and gravy did not become beloved because it erased poverty. It became beloved because it helped people endure it. By the time Americans began recording regional dishes in earnest, biscuits and gravy already had the feel of something inherited rather than invented. There is no single creator, one town, or one exact date. The dish emerged slowly, in thousands of kitchens, from repeated acts of thrift. Some cook had sausage drippings, some cook had flour, some cook had milk that needed using, some cook had hungry people waiting. It worked. Then it worked again. Then it became tradition. And that is where the irony begins. What began as a way to stretch pork became a weekend indulgence. What began as a breakfast for labourers became a nostalgic plate for travellers. What began in kitchens shaped by hardship became something people now seek out deliberately. Sometimes with artisanal sausage, cultured butter, and enough confidence to charge $18 for it at brunch, $18 for poor food. History has a sense of humour. Still, before you can understand the American classic, you have to pull apart its two halves. The biscuit is connected to ancient grains, shipbread, ovens, milling, wheat culture, and the long human obsession with making bread last longer than hunger. The gravy is connected to roasted meat, drippings, sauces, thickening, livestock, pork economies, and the refusal to waste fat in a world where fat meant survival. Put them together, and you get a dish that looks simple. It is not simple. It is agriculture, labour, class, race, chemistry, industrialization, war, memory, and marketing, all sitting quietly under a blanket of peppered gravy. So keep that plate in your mind for a moment. 2 split biscuits, steam rising from the crumb, gravy pooling at the edges, black pepper scattered like ash. It is calm. It is ordinary. It is almost sleepy. But beneath it is a long history of people trying to survive the morning. Storage. Before biscuits were southern, before they were split open under white gravy in a roadside diner, before they became something your grandmother might have made on a Sunday morning. They belonged to a much older and much rougher family of foods. They were not tender, they were not flaky. They were not meant to impress anyone. They were meant to last. To understand the biscuit, you have to go back to the first farmers who learned to grind grain between stones, mix it with water, and lay it near fire. That simple act happened in different forms across the ancient world, from the Fertile Crescent to the Nile Valley, from early farming villages in Europe to grain-growing communities in Asia and Africa. The earliest breads were not the soft loaves you picture today. They were flat, dense, coarse cakes, sometimes gritty with stone dust from the mill, sometimes smoky from the hearth, sometimes hard enough to feel less like food and more like a tool. But in a hungry world, that mattered less than you might think. A grain cake could travel, a grain cake could be stored, a grain cake could be broken, soaked, dipped, softened, or carried in a pouch when fresh food was impossible. This was not cuisine in the modern sense. It was portable survival. No refrigeration, no canned goods, no plastic wrapping, no supermarket aisle glowing under fluorescent lights. Just grain, water, fire. And the question every human community had to answer: how do you keep tomorrow from starving? Here's where the word biscuit begins to reveal itself. The English word comes through French from Latin roots meaning twice cooked, in Latin. panis biscuitus meant bread baked twice. That second baking was not decorative. It drove out moisture, and moisture was the enemy of storage. Mold loves softness. Time loves dampness. Armies, sailors, merchants, pilgrims, and labourers needed food that could resist both, so bread was baked, dried, and hardened. Then it was carried. Then it was eaten only because the alternative was worse. Think about Roman soldiers marching across roads that stretch for thousands of miles. Think about sailors crossing cold seas with barrels of salted meat, dried peas, and hard bread stored below deck. Think about medieval travellers walking through rain and mud with food that had to survive the journey as well as the person carrying it. The biscuit in this world was not a buttery round. It was an insurance policy. Hardtack is probably the most famous descendant of this idea. It was a simple cracker made of flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked until dry enough to last for months or even years. Sailors called versions of it ship biscuit. Soldiers knew it as army bread. It could be so hard that people had to soak it in coffee, broth, or water before eating. Sometimes it contained weevils. Sometimes it broke teeth. Sometimes it was the only thing between a person and collapse, not comfort, rations. And yet, pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that comes later. A biscuit was originally valuable not because it was delicious, but because it was dependable. It was food engineered for scarcity. It was food made to endure neglect, weather, distance, and time. That older meaning never fully disappears, even when the American biscuit becomes soft and warm and tender. Its deep ancestry still belongs to the same logic. Make flour useful. Make hunger wait. Make a meal from the little you have. Across Europe, the word biscuit took different paths. In Britain, a biscuit became what many Americans would call a cookie or a cracker, something crisp, small, and baked dry. In France, it could mean a delicate cake or a twice-baked sweet. In Italy, biscotti kept the older idea clearly, a baked item cooked again until firm enough to dip into wine or coffee. The name changed clothing from country to country, but the old principle stayed underneath. Dryness meant life. That sounds dramatic today, when a stale cracker is mostly a disappointment, but in the ancient and medieval world, storage could be the line between order and panic. Grain harvests came once or twice a year. Winters were long, roads were bad, armies moved slowly, ships disappeared. A food that kept was a food that made movement possible. It fed soldiers who guarded frontiers. It fed sailors who connected continents. It fed poor families through lean seasons. This was not just bread, it was infrastructure now. The southern biscuit seems very far away from all of this, and in one sense it is. The soft American biscuit would eventually depend on milled wheat flour, chemical leavening, dairy fat, lard, ovens, and a particular domestic food culture. But in another sense, it remains connected to these older survival breads through one important fact: it begins with flour and necessity. No flour, no biscuit, no stored grain, no breakfast. The journey from ancient hard bread to southern biscuit is also a journey from preservation to tenderness. For most of history, the problem was how to make bread last. In the American South, the problem gradually became how to make quick bread rise without yeast, how to make it soft without expensive ingredients, and how to make a filling breakfast before labour began. That change did not happen all at once. It took milling technology, trade, colonization, class aspiration, and chemistry. But the ancestor is still there, hiding in plain sight. The biscuit started as bread you could carry across an empire or an ocean. Later, it became bread you could make quickly beside a hearth. Later still, It became bread you could split open under gravy and eat with a fork while half asleep at a diner counter. The path is strange, but the logic is consistent. It was never only about taste. It was about time, storage, labour, and hunger. So when you look at a soft biscuit today, golden on top and pale inside, it is worth remembering that its distant relatives were hard enough to survive a voyage and plain enough to make a modern diner cry into their coffee. That is not an insult. That was the point. A beautiful biscuit could wait until later. First, humanity had to solve the problem of food that would not rot, and once people learned to make dry bread last. The next question was obvious. Just what could you pour over it? Before gravy belonged to biscuits. It belonged to the pan. That is the first thing to understand. Gravy did not begin as a recipe written neatly in a cookbook, with measured flour, milk, pepper, and a polite instruction to whisk until smooth. It began as the dark, sticky, intensely flavoured residue left behind after meat met heat. A roast came out of the fire, a bird came off the spit, a piece of pork, beef, mutton, or game left juices behind in the vessel beneath it. Those juices were too valuable to throw away, so people did not throw them away. They scraped them, they loosened them, they thickened them, they poured them back over food. Gravy was not luxury, it was recovery. Long before America existed, cooks across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia understood that liquid carried flavour. Ancient cooks made sauces from fermented fish, herbs, vinegar, wine, oil, grain pastes, blood, nuts, and meat juices. Roman kitchens used garum, a fermented fish sauce, in quantities that might startle you today. Medieval European households made pottages and broths that stretched grain, vegetables, bones, herbs, and scraps into something sustaining in elite kitchens. Sauces could be elaborate, perfumed with spices that had crossed oceans and deserts in poor kitchens. The principle was simpler. Do not waste what the fire has given you. That was gravy's first commandment. The word itself probably comes into English through medieval French. Connected to the seasoned juices or sauces served with meat, its exact early history is a little slippery, as food words often are, because ordinary people were cooking long before anyone bothered to record their methods carefully. But the practice is not slippery at all. A pan produced drippings. Drippings held fat, salt, browned proteins, and memory, add liquid, and the flavour spread. Here's the detail that makes this strange. In modern kitchens, gravy often feels like an addition, something extra spooned on top of the real food. Historically, it was often the opposite. It was the way the real food went farther. If you had a small amount of meat, its juices could season a much larger amount of bread. Grain, potatoes, dumplings, greens, or porridge. This was not about covering food. It was about extending food. A little meat became a meal. A little fat became richness. A little flour, later, became body. This was survival mathematics again. Think about a medieval household on a cold day. The room is dim. The hearth is not decorative. It is heat, light, stove, and gathering place all at once. Meat is expensive for many people, and even when animals are slaughtered, every part matters. Bones become broth, fat is rendered, blood is cooked, stale bread is saved. Drippings are captured because fat is dense energy, and energy is the thing labouring bodies need most. In a world of hard work and thin margins, fat was not a villain. Fat was warmth. Fat was stamina. Fat was the difference between feeling fed and feeling merely filled. You have to understand this before biscuits and gravy can make sense. The gravy that will eventually cover southern biscuits descends from a very old household instinct to take what remains in the pan and make it feed more people than it should. In Britain, where many of the food traditions that shaped early Anglo-American cooking developed, Roasted meats and their gravies became central to domestic meals. The Sunday roast, with juices collected and thickened, carried both practicality and ritual. Bread sauce, onion gravy, meat gravies, and dripping-based preparations all reflected a world in which starches and sauces worked together. Bread did not simply sit beside the meal, it absorbed the meal. That matters, because before the soft southern biscuit had white sausage gravy, older breads had meat juices, hard bread, stale bread, trenchers, puddings, dumplings, and boiled grains all benefited from moisture. Dry starch needed liquid. Liquid needed a carrier. The partnership was obvious. Bread and gravy found each other naturally. No grand invention was required. Some early gravies were thin, closer to broth. Some were thickened with breadcrumbs, ground nuts, egg yolks, blood, or grain. Flour-thickened gravies became more common as refined wheat flour became more available, and as cooking practices shifted in Europe and America. This is an important turning point, because flour does something powerful. It turns fat and liquid into a sauce that clings. It gives poor kitchens a way to create this sensation of abundance, not more meat. The feeling of more meat. That difference is everything. A pan gravy made from drippings, flour, and water could coat potatoes. Bread, or cornmeal mush. A milk gravy could make a breakfast plate seem rich even when the amount of sausage was tiny. A peppered gravy could wake up plain food without requiring expensive spices beyond black pepper, which by the 19th century had become far more accessible than it had been in the age when spices moved like treasure across trade routes. Here is the quiet genius of gravy. It hides scarcity without denying it. You still know there is not much meat. You still know the pantry is limited, but the plate looks full. The food is warm. The bread softens. The salt and fat reach every bite. It works emotionally as well as physically. That is why gravies appear so often in poor and working class cuisines. They make dryness edible and leftovers respectable. They join ingredients that would otherwise sit apart. They turn yesterday's fat into today's breakfast. They forgive stale bread, tough meat, cheap flour, and watery milk. They are forgiving foods for unforgiving lives. Of course, elite kitchens had gravies too, and some of them were magnificent. Cooks in wealthy households reduced stocks, clarified sauces, strained liquids through cloth, and seasoned them with imported spices. But that is not the stream that leads most directly to biscuits and gravy. The important stream runs through farm kitchens, taverns, campfires, plantations, tenant cabins, logging camps, and boarding houses. Places where food had to be filling, places where waste was impossible, places where the cook understood the pan better than any written recipe. This is where the story begins to bend toward America. European settlers carried habits of roasted meat, dripping sauces, flour thickening, and bread soaking into the colonies. African cooks, indigenous ingredients, local animals, new crops, and brutal systems of labor would transform those habits into something distinctly southern. But the logic was already waiting. Save the fat, brown the flour, add liquid. Feed everyone. That formula seemed small. It was not. It became one half of a breakfast that could carry people through fields, mines, mills, and roads. But before gravy could become white and peppered, before it could be called sawmill or sausage gravy, before it could blanket a biscuit like a quilt, wheat itself had to cross the Atlantic and take root in a new and difficult world. And that is where the oven enters the story. When wheat crossed the Atlantic, it didn't arrive alone. It came with people who carried recipes in memory, tools in cargo holds, animals in pens, and assumptions packed deeper than luggage. English, Scottish, Irish, German, Dutch, French, Spanish, and African food traditions all entered the colonies unevenly. colliding with indigenous agriculture and unfamiliar soil. Some settlers wanted bread that reminded them of home, some wanted beer, some wanted profit, some wanted a stable crop that could be stored, taxed, shipped, and sold. Wheat promised all of that, but promises made in Europe did not always survive American weather. In the 17th and 18th centuries, wheat grew best in the middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and parts of Virginia. The climate was kinder, the soils were more suitable, mills appeared along creeks and rivers, because grain is only half useful until it can be ground. A field of wheat is potential. A mill turns it into flour, and flour turns it into bread. Trade, rent, wages, and power. Pay attention to that chain. Field, mill, oven, table. Every link mattered. In colonial towns, bread could become a public issue. Authorities sometimes regulated loaf weights and prices because bread was not just food, it was social stability. If grain prices rose too quickly, if bakers cheated the weight, if harvests failed. People noticed immediately. A hungry crowd does not need a political theory to understand an empty stomach. Bread riots had already haunted Europe, and colonial officials knew that grain shortages could make ordinary people furious. This was not about luxury, it was about order. But the South was different. Not completely different, but different enough to shape the Biscuits' future. In much of the warmer, humid South, wheat was harder to grow reliably than corn. Corn thrived. Corn was indigenous to the Americas, adapted to many local conditions, and already central to native food systems long before Europeans arrived. It could be boiled, roasted, ground, dried, stored, and turned into meal. It did not require the same kind of European milling infrastructure that refined wheat demanded. For many ordinary southern households, corn was practical in a way wheat was not. So for a long time, the everyday bread of much of the South was not the biscuit. It was cornbread, hoe cakes, ash cakes, johnny cakes, corn dodgers, mush pone, and other corn-based breads fed people across lines of race and class. Though not equally and not under the same conditions, a corn cake could be cooked on a hoe blade, a griddle, a hearthstone, or in ashes. That flexibility mattered in cabins, camps, fields, and kitchens where a proper oven might be unavailable or unreliable. Wheat bread, by contrast, carried status. This is the part modern breakfast menus can hide. Today, a biscuit feels rustic in many early southern settings. Refined wheat flour was not rustic at all. It was a sign of access. If you could put white flour biscuits on the table, especially light, pale, carefully handled biscuits, you were announcing something. You had the means to buy or produce wheat flour. You had a kitchen with the right equipment. You had labour available to sift, mix, cut, bake, and serve. You had enough fuel for baking. You had time. Time was a class marker too. Think about that for a second. A biscuit now may suggest simplicity, but simplicity depends on who is doing the work. For the person eating it, the biscuit might feel effortless for the person making it, especially in a household where cooking was done over live fire. It required judgment. Too much handling made it tough. Too little heat left it pale and heavy. Poor flour changed the texture. Old fat changed the smell. Bad timing ruined the batch. No timer. No thermostat, no packaged mix, just hands, heat, and experience. European settlers brought ovens, but ovens were not evenly distributed. Some households had brick ovens. Some relied on hearth cooking. Some cooked in Dutch ovens with coals piled above and beneath. Iron technology mattered here. A covered iron pot could create an oven-like chamber, allowing breads to bake where built-in ovens were scarce. This kind of practical adaptation helped quick breads and small baked goods become more possible in everyday American life. Still, early colonial biscuits were not yet the soft baking powder biscuits you know. Many were closer to small breads, rolls, crackers, or twice-baked items. Yeast breads took time and skill. Beaten biscuits, which would become associated with parts of the Upper South, required flour, fat, liquid, and a long, exhausting process of pounding or beating the dough to work air into it before baking. Some recipes called for hundreds of blows. Hundreds. That is not a casual breakfast. That is a workout disguised as hospitality. And here is where irony settles in quietly. The biscuit that later became a symbol of rural ease once depended on either chemical leavening that did not yet exist in common form, or labour so intense that someone had to do it out of sight, often that someone was a woman in wealthy households, that someone might be enslaved. The plate looked graceful, the kitchen did not. As colonial society expanded, wheat flour moved through networks of farms, mills, merchants, ports, and households. Flour barrels travelled by wagon and boat, millers took tolls, bakers supplied towns, plantation households bought, grew, stored, and rationed grain. But in poorer rural areas, especially farther from mills or markets, corn remained the dependable staple. Wheat flour might be saved for special occasions, guests, holidays, or genteel meals where the appearance of refinement mattered. That tension shaped Southern food deeply. Corn fed the many, wheat impressed the few. Over time, cheaper flour and new leaveners would blur that line. But the memory of status stayed in the food. A white biscuit could mean hospitality. It could mean Sunday. It could mean the household was doing better than bare survival, even when that appearance was fragile. Here is the quiet turn in the story. The American biscuit did not emerge simply because settlers loved bread. It emerged because wheat entered a world where class, labour, geography, and aspiration all pressed on the same lump of dough in the South. The biscuit would have to compete with corn, depend on mills, borrow from older European bread traditions, and eventually transform through chemistry. But before chemistry could make biscuits rise, society had already made them meaningful. A biscuit was not just flour, it was access. Corn was the South's daily bread long before the biscuit became its icon. You have to picture the early Southern table without the romance that later got painted over it in many cabins, farmhouses, quarters, camps, and backcountry settlements. The dependable staple was not a basket of tall, white, flaky biscuits. It was cornmeal. Corn was boiled into mush, fried into cakes, baked into pone, shaped into dodgers, stirred into hominy, and cooked in ways that could survive poor equipment, long labour, and uncertain harvests. It was flexible, forgiving, and native to the land in a way imported wheat traditions were not. That mattered. Corn could grow in soils and climates where wheat struggled. Corn could feed people and livestock. Corn could be dried, ground, and stored. Corn could be cooked quickly with little more than meal, water, salt, and heat. For poor households, that was not a culinary preference. It was a practical answer to a hard question. What can we afford to eat every day? For many Southerners, the answer was corn. And here is the tension that shaped the biscuit's rise. Corn may have fed the region, but wheat carried a social ambition. Wheat flour, especially refined white flour, had a different meaning. It looked cleaner. It seemed more delicate. It belonged to European ideas of refinement, gentility, and proper domestic display. A plate of corn cakes could be sturdy and nourishing, but a plate of white biscuits could say something else. We are respectable. We are prosperous enough. We can offer guests something finer. This was not because wheat was naturally superior. It was because societies attach meaning to food, and those meanings can be ruthless. In the Old South, whiteness itself became part of the symbolism, not only in the racial order of society, but in the visual language of the table: white flour, white sugar, white table linen, white porcelain. Pale foods could be made to stand for purity, wealth, control, and distance from field labour. That symbolism was ugly in some ways, revealing in others, and impossible to separate from the world that produced it. This was not just breakfast, it was hierarchy. Think about a household where guests were expected. The cook might prepare meat, preserves, coffee if available, perhaps eggs, perhaps butter, and if the household could manage it, biscuits. Not the ancient ship biscuit, not the hard cracker, a more tender bread, served warm, made to show skill. The biscuit sat in that strange middle ground between necessity and performance. It was food, yes, but it was also evidence. Evidence of flour, evidence of fat, evidence of labour, evidence that somebody had the time and skill to make the table look abundant. The poor knew this distinction clearly, so did the wealthy, so did visitors, enslaved cooks, hired cooks, daughters learning household management, and anyone else watching what appeared on the table. Food spoke a social language. Cornbread said one thing, wheat biscuits said another. Not always, not everywhere, and not with one simple rule, but often enough to matter. This is why the biscuit story is not just about ingredients, it is about aspiration. A family that could not afford wheat flour every day might save it. A woman might use it for Sunday, for company, for a holiday, for a preacher visiting after church, for a moment when the household needed to look more stable than it felt. That little mound of dough carried emotional weight. It suggested gentility, even when the roof leaked. It suggested care, even when money was short. It suggested that poverty had not won completely. And that is one reason biscuits became so powerful in memory. People often remember the foods that made scarcity feel briefly suspended. But for most of the 18th and early 19th centuries, corn remained the foundation for ordinary southern eating. Cornbread was not a side dish in the modern sense. It was central. It accompanied greens, beans, pork, molasses, milk, and whatever else could be found. It filled plates. It absorbed pot liquor. The mineral-rich broth left after greens or vegetables had simmered with meat scraps or fat. It was breakfast, dinner, supper, and leftover. It could be eaten hot, cold, fresh, stale, soaked, fried, or crumbled. Corn did not ask much, that was its genius. By contrast, wheat asked for more. It wanted the right soil, the right climate, the right milling, and often the right market connection. Wheat flour could spoil or become infested if stored badly. Good flour cost money. Fine flour cost more. To turn it into something impressive required fat, heat, and technique. Even before baking powder made biscuits easier, there were labour-intensive versions like beaten biscuits, which became associated with hospitality in parts of the South. The dough had to be worked and struck repeatedly until air was forced into it. Some cooks used a rolling pin, some used an axe handle, some used specialised machines later on. Imagine explaining to a hungry child that breakfast is delayed because the bread needs to be beaten into submission. Dry humour aside, the labour was real, and labour is the hidden ingredient you should never forget. In wealthy white households, refined southern food depended on other people's work, and often on enslaved black cooks, whose knowledge, judgment, and physical endurance shaped dishes later credited vaguely to regional tradition. In poorer households, women performed the same exhausting domestic labour without servants, often after or before fieldwork, childcare, laundering, hauling water, tending fires, and preserving food. The biscuit may look gentle on a plate, but it came from hands that were rarely allowed to rest. Here is where the story begins to narrow toward biscuits and gravy. The eventual pairing required wheat biscuits to become more common, and that could not happen while flour stayed too expensive or too difficult for everyday use. It also required a culture already trained to stretch fat and liquid across starch. Cornbread had been doing that for generations, absorbing pot liquor, gravy, molasses, milk, and meat juices. The southern table already understood the relationship between bread and sauce. The biscuit did not invent that relationship. It inherited it. As transportation improved, mills spread, and commercial flour became easier to obtain, the status line around wheat began to shift. What had once been special moved slowly toward ordinary, not for everyone at once, not evenly, but steadily. Poorer families could begin to imagine biscuits more often. Rural stores could sell flour. Industrial milling would eventually make white flour cheaper and more uniform. Chemical leaveners would make light biscuits less dependent on exhausting labour. The biscuit was waiting for technology. The South was waiting too, although nobody knew it that way. Corn still ruled the everyday plate. Wheat still carried prestige. Class still shaped the table. But the ingredients of change were gathering quietly in mills, markets, and kitchens. And once wheat biscuits became easier, cheaper, and faster, they would meet the one thing Southern cooks had always known how to save: drippings. The biscuit could not become Southern without the plantation kitchen, and the plantation kitchen cannot be discussed gently. You have to walk into that room with the romance stripped away, not the cheerful painting of a warm hearth and a smiling cook, not the cookbook memory that turns violence into hospitality. The real plantation kitchen was a workplace inside a system of forced labour, surveillance, punishment, exhaustion, and theft. The food that later became famous as Southern cuisine was shaped there by people who were not free to leave, not free to own the fruits of their skill, and often not free to protect even their own families from sale. This is where the story turns dark. By the time plantation agriculture expanded across the American South, enslaved Africans and their descendants were cooking under conditions created by slavery. They prepared food for enslavers' tables, for household dependents, for guests, and often for other enslaved people when rations allowed. They handled fires, carried water, lifted iron pots, butchered animals, cleaned kitchens, preserved meat, baked breads, stretched leftovers, and fed households whose comfort depended on their labour. This was not assistance, it was coercion. The numbers behind that coercion are staggering. Before the Civil War, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States. Nearly 4 million. Their labour built fortunes in cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, and other crops. But it also built the domestic world of the South, including its food. Every polished dining room depended on a hidden chain of field hands, cooks, laundresses, dairy workers, gardeners, drivers, blacksmiths, millers, and children sent on errands before they were old enough to understand the machinery around them. Think about that for a second. A white flour biscuit on a wealthy table might look innocent, but to make it, someone had to grow or buy the wheat, grind or purchase the flour, render or procure the fat, manage the fire, mix the dough, bake it, serve it, clean the pan, and begin again. In a slave-holding household, much of that work could be forced from enslaved people. The biscuit was not just a food, it was part of an economy of command. And here is the uncomfortable reality. Southern cuisine did not merely borrow from black labour, it was transformed by black knowledge. Enslaved cooks brought and preserved foodways rooted in West and Central Africa, then adapted them under brutal American conditions. They knew how to season, stretch, substitute, preserve, smoke, stew, fry, ferment, and improvise. They worked with corn, rice, greens, peas, okra, sweet potatoes, pork, peppers, and whatever else the region and the ration system supplied. They did not have the luxury of waste, they did have skill. That distinction matters. In plantation kitchens, enslaved cooks often had to satisfy enslavers' tastes while also managing scarcity and danger. A burned dish could bring punishment. A delayed meal could bring punishment. A perceived slight could bring punishment. The kitchen was hot, smoky, and physically punishing. Fires had to be maintained in every season. In summer, the heat could feel suffocating. Grease popped from pans, smoke stung the eyes, ash settled on skin and cloth. Water was heavy. Iron was heavier. The smell of lard, wood smoke, boiling greens, scorched flour, and meat fat would cling to clothing long after the meal had been carried away. Hospitality upstairs could mean exhaustion downstairs. That is not a metaphor. It was the structure. Because plantation households valued appearances, food became a stage. Guests were meant to see abundance. They were meant to see refinement. They were meant to see tables heavy with breads, meats, relishes, preserves, cakes, and sauces. What they were not meant to see clearly was the forced labour that made abundance appear effortless. That was part of the illusion. Good service, in the eyes of enslavers, meant the disappearance of the worker. The worker did not disappear. The worker was carrying the world. This is especially important for biscuits, because biscuit making rewarded judgment. A good biscuit required knowledge of flour texture, fat temperature, dough moisture, oven heat, and timing. Written recipes can make that sound simple. It was not simple over a live fire, with uneven flour, variable fat, and no modern temperature control. Cooks learned by touch. Too wet, and the dough sagged. Too dry, and the biscuit turned hard. Too much handling, and it became tough. Too little heat, and it sat pale and heavy. The skill lived in the hands. The same was true of gravy. Drippings had to be judged by smell and colour. Flour had to cook long enough to lose rawness without burning. Milk or water had to be added carefully enough to prevent lumps. Pepper, salt, and bits of pork had to be balanced so that a small amount of flavour could carry across many mouths. These were not minor household tricks. They were technologies of survival and service. And yet, after emancipation and into the age of lost cause nostalgia, white Southern memory often tried to separate the food from the violence. Plantation cookbooks, memoirs, and romantic stories softened slavery into loyalty and domestic charm. They praised the table while blurring the people who made it possible. They turned forced labour into quaint tradition. They turned cooks into caricatures. This is the part that should make you angry, because people were not ingredients. Their knowledge was not naturally available for others to claim. Their work was not folklore floating in the air. It was carried in bodies that were owned under law, threatened under custom, and exploited every day. Still, enslaved cooks and their descendants were not passive vessels. They created, adapted, remembered, resisted, and preserved. Food could carry memory even when records did not. Techniques moved from plantation kitchens to black households, churches, restaurants, rail dining cars, boarding houses, and community gatherings. After emancipation, black cooks, caterers, domestic workers, and entrepreneurs continued shaping American food, often while receiving little credit and less pay. So when you hear that biscuits and gravy are Southern, hold two truths at once. The dish became associated with poor white rural tables, labour camps, diners, and family kitchens. But the broader food world that made it possible was profoundly shaped by enslaved black labour and black culinary intelligence. There is no honest history of Southern breakfast without that fact. Not a side note, the foundation. The story now moves from kitchens of forced abundance to a humbler but equally important economy, the hog pen. The smokehouse, the rendered fat cooling in a jar. Because if wheat gave biscuits their body, and labour gave them their meaning. Pork gave gravy its soul. If wheat gave the biscuit its body, pork gave the gravy its memory. To understand why, you have to step outside the kitchen and walk toward the smokehouse, because the smell of biscuits and gravy did not begin with a breakfast plate. It began with hogs rooting through woods, with salted meat hanging from rafters, with rendered lard cooling in crocks, and with families calculating how to make one slaughtered animal last through months of hard work. In the rural South, the hog was not just livestock, it was a pantry on legs. Cattle needed more pasture, more fencing, more investment, and more careful management. Hogs were different. They were hardy, opportunistic, and remarkably efficient at turning scraps, mast, acorns, roots, corn, and kitchen waste into meat and fat. They could roam in wooded land. They could fend for themselves better than many animals. They could be driven to market. They could be slaughtered at home, and almost every part could be used. That mattered in a world where waste was not immoral because someone said so in a cookbook. Waste was dangerous. A hog could become hams, shoulders, ribs, bacon, sausage, salt pork, cracklings, head cheese, liver pudding, chitterlings, bones for seasoning, and lard for cooking. The meat could be salted, smoked, dried, packed, or preserved through winter. The fat could fry corn cakes, season greens, enrich beans, tenderize biscuits, and form the base of gravy. One animal entered the household economy in pieces, and each piece carried a job. The smokehouse was the bank. Not metaphorically, not sentimentally, in many rural households, preserved pork represented stored calories, stored labour, stored value, and stored time. A smokehouse full of meat meant some protection against hunger. An empty one meant the year could turn frightening very quickly. You did not need a stock ticker to know your household's condition. You could open the smokehouse door and smell it. Salt, smoke, fat, survival. Butcher Day had its own rhythm. It usually came with cold weather, because cold helped keep meat from spoiling during processing. The work could begin before dawn. Water heated in large kettles. Knives were sharpened. Fires were managed. Neighbours might help, because one hog was heavy, hot, slippery work, and several hogs were an event. The air carried the metallic smell of blood, the steam of scalding water, the greasy sweetness of fresh fat, the smoke from fires, and the low talk of people who knew exactly what had to be done. Nothing was casual about it. The animal had to be killed, bled, scalded, scraped, opened, divided, salted, ground, stuffed, rendered, cooked, and stored. Children watched and learned. Adults moved quickly. Fat was cut and melted down slowly, turning from pale pieces into clear liquid lard. Cracklings were left behind, crisp and salty. And in some households they became food in their own right, folded into cornbread or eaten hot. Sausage was seasoned, often with sage, pepper, red pepper, or whatever the household used. The exact flavour of a family's breakfast could begin there. Here is the part that explains the gravy. Pork drippings were flavour concentrate when sausage cooked in a skillet. It left behind fat, browned bits, salt, pepper, and tiny fragments of meat. That residue looked modest, but it held the taste of the entire animal economy. Flour could catch it, milk or water could loosen it. Stirring could turn it into something that covered biscuits, potatoes, grits, corn cakes, or whatever starch was on hand. This was not a sauce added for decoration. This was pork made democratic. A small amount of sausage could season a large breakfast. A few tablespoons of fat could make flour taste rich. The skillet, if treated properly, became a place where scarcity was negotiated. You might not have enough meat for everyone to eat a full portion. but gravy could distribute the impression of meat across every plate. Not abundance, the sensation of abundance. That difference sits at the centre of country cooking. Lard also shaped the biscuit itself, before vegetable shortening became common, and long before people argued over butter versus shortening in glossy magazines. Animal fat was a practical household staple. Lard made biscuits tender because fat interfered with gluten formation and helped create a softer crumb. Good leaf lard, taken from around the kidneys, was especially prized for baking because it had a mild flavour and smooth texture. Less refined fat could carry a stronger pork taste, which was not always a flaw in a kitchen where pork was the point. Imagine the dough under the cook's fingers, flour in a bowl, salt, maybe a leavener, depending on the period, lard rubbed or cut into the flour until it looked like coarse meal, milk or buttermilk added just enough to bring it together. The hands had to know when to stop. A biscuit can be ruined by enthusiasm, too much handling, and tenderness disappears. There is a quiet lesson there. Restraint makes softness. Then the biscuits baked, and the sausage cooked, and the drippings waited if milk was available. The gravy turned pale and creamy. If milk was scarce, water could do the job, thinner and plainer but still useful, if black pepper was on hand. It gave the whole thing a bite that felt bigger than the ingredients. If bits of sausage remained, they became little surprises in the gravy, tiny proofs that meat had been there. Small things mattered. They still do. You can see why pork became so central to Southern breakfast. It fit the landscape, it fit the economy, it fit the labour schedule. Salted or smoked pork could be sliced in the morning and cooked quickly. Sausage could be made from trimmings. Fat could be saved. Bones could season pots of greens or beans. Nothing had to be glamorous to be valuable. And there is another layer. Pork was tied to independence, or at least the fragile version of independence available to poor rural families. A family that could raise hogs had some control over food outside the cash economy. That did not mean they were safe. Debt, land exhaustion, crop failure, illness, and exploitative credit could still crush them, but a hog in the pen, or meat in the smokehouse, gave a household something concrete to lean on. That is why pork fat shows up again and again in poor and working class cooking. It was not just taste, it was security rendered into grease. Of course, this security was uneven. Enslaved people were often given limited rations, including cornmeal and some form of pork, chosen not out of kindness but as a calculated means of extracting labour at minimal cost. After emancipation, sharecroppers and tenant farmers continued to rely on pork because the larger economy remained cruelly tight. In mill villages, lumber camps, mining communities, and railroad boarding houses, cheap pork and flour could feed bodies that were being worn down for profit. So when sausage gravy later became beloved, it carried more than comfort. It carried the smokehouse, the slaughter, the ration, the debt ledger, the winter pantry, the woman at the stove, and the worker leaving before sunrise. The gravy was white, but its history was not blank. It was written in fat. The biscuit became easier when chemistry entered the kitchen. For most of its long life, bread depended on patience. Yeast needed time, fermentation needed warmth, moisture, and luck. A cook could save a starter, brew yeast from beer, borrow from a neighbour, or rely on experience. But none of that was simple when breakfast had to happen quickly and work was waiting. The soft southern biscuit needed a shortcut. And the shortcut arrived not from a grandmother's secret, but from 19th century science. At first, the shortcut was pearl ash. Pearl ash was an alkaline substance made from wood ashes, related to potash, and it could react with acidic ingredients to produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the invisible force that makes dough lift. It makes heaviness loosen. It makes a dense lump seem alive. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, American cooks began using chemical leaveners in quick breads, cakes, and biscuits. Although the results could be uneven, too much alkali left a bitter, soapy flavour. Too little, and the dough sat there like a damp brick. Still, the idea was powerful. No waiting for yeast, no long fermentation, no beating dough hundreds of times. Just chemistry. Then came saleratus, an early form of baking soda, and later cream of tartar combinations. Baking soda needed an acid to react properly, and southern kitchens had a perfect partner: buttermilk. The old-fashioned buttermilk left after churning butter was naturally tangy, slightly acidic, and already part of dairy life on farms. Mix it with soda, and the dough could rise quickly, not dramatically like a balloon, not perfectly every time, but enough. Enough changed everything. Think about what that meant for a cook at dawn. Instead of planning bread hours ahead, she could sift flour, cut in lard, add buttermilk, shape the dough, and get biscuits into the oven before the household fully woke. The chemistry did not remove labour, it did not make poverty disappear, it did not stop the water from needing to be hauled or the fire from needing attention, but it reduced one kind of difficulty. That mattered. The true revolution came when baking powder became commercially available and more reliable. Baking powder combined an alkaline ingredient, usually baking soda, with a dry acid and a starch to keep the mixture stable. Add liquid, and the reaction began. Some powders were single-acting, meaning they released gas when wet. Later double-acting powders released some gas when mixed and more when heated. That second reaction was forgiving. It gave dough a little more grace. Grace is not a small thing in a poor kitchen. In 1856, Eber Norton Horsford, a Harvard chemist, developed an improved phosphate-based baking powder with George F. Wilson. Their work helped lead to Rumford baking powder, named after Count Rumford, the scientific reformer whose endowment had supported Horsford's academic chair. That is the sort of strange historical link food often hides. A biscuit on a plate can connect to a university laboratory, a chemical patent, and a global shift in home baking. All before the gravy even arrives. Later, baking powder became a fiercely competitive business. Companies argued over ingredients, purity, price, health claims, and trust. Some powders used cream of tartar, some used phosphates, some used alum, which critics attacked as suspicious or harmful. Advertising filled newspapers and cookbooks. Demonstrators showed women how to bake higher, lighter, more predictable biscuits and cakes. Brands pushed themselves into the domestic imagination, promising modern reliability in a can. This was not only food science, it was marketing, and it worked. By the late 19th century, chemical leavening had transformed American quick breads. Biscuits no longer required yeast, long rising times, or punishing beaten biscuit labour. A cook still needed skill, but the basic method became more accessible. Flour, fat, liquid, leavening, heat. The biscuit could move from occasional refinement toward ordinary breakfast. The timing was important, because flour itself was changing too. For much of earlier history, milling was local and imperfect. Stone-ground flour included more of the wheat kernel, which could be nutritious but less predictable in delicate baking. Then industrial roller milling expanded in the 19th century. Steel rollers could separate bran and germ more efficiently from the starchy endosperm, producing finer, whiter, more consistent flour. White flour had already carried status. Industrial milling helped make that status cheaper, not equal, cheaper. That distinction matters. Railroads, commercial mills, paper packaging, and national brands pushed flour farther into rural markets. Store-bought flour became increasingly common in the South. Softer variety of winter wheat were especially suited to tender biscuits, because they had lower protein than hard bread wheat. Lower protein means less gluten strength, and less gluten strength means a softer, more delicate crumb. This is why southern biscuit makers later prized soft wheat flours so intensely. The texture was not magic, it was grain chemistry. Pay attention to this, because it explains why biscuits became so regionally specific. Bread flour wants strength. Biscuit flour wants tenderness. A chewy loaf and a delicate biscuit are not asking wheat to do the same job. The South, with access to soft wheat flours, developed a biscuit culture that depended on weakness. That sounds insulting. It is not. Weak flour made tender bread. Tender bread became pride. Companies eventually built entire identities around that fact. White Lily, founded in Knoxville in the late 19th century, became famous for soft wheat flour and beloved by generations of southern biscuit makers. The brand's reputation rested on something home cooks could feel in their hands. Dough made from soft flour handled differently. It needed less liquid. It made biscuits that could be lighter, shorter, and more delicate. To outsiders, flour might be flour. To a biscuit cook, that idea is almost offensive. The cook knows a change in flour changes everything. Meanwhile, factory-made baking powder and soda made recipes more standardized. Cookbooks could give instructions with greater confidence. Agricultural bulletins, women's magazines, and product pamphlets spread formulas. Domestic science teachers taught measurement, hygiene, and modern efficiency. Some of this helped women manage kitchens. Some of it also condescended to traditional cooks whose knowledge had never needed laboratory language to be real. The measuring spoon arrived and acted like it had invented wisdom. It had not. But standardization did make biscuits more reproducible. That mattered in boarding houses, hotels, restaurants, rail depots, lumber camps, and eventually diners. A cook feeding many people needed food that worked repeatedly. Baking powder biscuits did. They were fast, cheap, filling, and well suited to gravy. They could be made in quantity before dawn. They could be split, covered, served, and eaten quickly. They were old enough to feel traditional and modern enough to scale. Here is the turn nobody would have noticed at the time. Chemistry did not create biscuits and gravy from nothing. It removed obstacles. It made the biscuit quicker, lighter, and more democratic, so that the gravy had a better partner, no longer only a status bread or a labour-heavy specialty. The biscuit could become a daily vehicle for fat, milk, pepper, and pork. A small can of powder changed the morning, and in the mills and camps that came next, morning needed changing badly. In the camps and mills of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, breakfast had to be cheap, fast, and heavy enough to carry a man into dangerous work. That is where sawmill gravy enters the story. The name sounds almost cozy now, like something printed on a laminated menu beside smiling cartoons of roosters and cast-iron skillets. But sawmill gravy came out of places that were loud, rough, temporary, and hard on bodies. Logging camps cut deep into southern forests. Sawmills screamed from before daylight until evening. Railroads pushed through mountains and pine country. Workers slept in bunkhouses, ate in mess halls, and burned through calories at a rate that modern office life can barely imagine. A logger could swing an axe, drag chains, load timber, walk through mud, and work around machinery that could take fingers, hands, or lives in a second. A sawmill hand listened all day to the shriek of blades biting into wood, the thump of boards, the cough of engines, the shouted warnings, the scrape of boots through sawdust. The air smelled of pine resin, sweat, oil, wet bark, smoke, and hot metal in winter. Clothes stiffened with damp cold in summer. Sawdust stuck to skin like grit. These men needed fuel. Employers wanted that fuel to cost almost nothing. There it is, the economic centre of the dish. Sawmill gravy was usually a flour-thickened gravy made from drippings, milk or water, salt, and pepper. Sometimes it included sausage, sometimes it did not. Sometimes it was rich and creamy, sometimes it was thin, pale, and stretched so far that workers joked about being able to read a newspaper through it. The name is often linked to logging camps and sawmills, where cheap gravy was served over biscuits to feed crews. The exact origin is not pinned to one cook or one town, because foods like this rarely begin with a ribbon-cutting ceremony. They happen wherever necessity repeats itself long enough to acquire a name. And the name was not always affectionate. Some accounts say the gravy was called sawmill gravy, because it was eaten in sawmill camps. Others point to jokes that it looked flecked with sawdust, especially when made with browned flour, cornmeal, or coarse sausage bits. Whether the nickname began as description, insult, or camp humour, it tells you something. This was working food. It belonged to men and women close enough to poverty that a cheap plate could become both complaint and gratitude. The gravy was not fancy, it was filling. That was the point. Picture the camp breakfast, a long table, tin plates, coffee strong enough to taste burned, biscuits stacked in pans or baskets, gravy ladled out in quantity because quantity mattered more than elegance. The biscuits might be made from commercial flour, chemical leavening, fat, and milk or water. They were quick, reliable, and absorbent. They could be baked in batches before the crew moved out, once covered in gravy. They became warm, soft, salty, and dense with calories, no garnish. No ceremony, just survival with pepper in it. The genius of sawmill gravy was that it allowed the employer or camp cook to stretch animal fat across flour. Sausage was useful, but it did not have to dominate. A small amount of pork could season a pot large enough to feed many workers. Flour gave thickness. Milk, when available, gave body and sweetness. Water made a poorer version. But a poor version was still breakfast. Black pepper carried the illusion of richness, waking up the mouth when the ingredients themselves were plain. This was not a meal built around meat, it was a meal haunted by meat. That is why biscuits and gravy became so deeply associated with poverty food. The plate could resemble abundance while containing very little that cost money. Flour was cheap, lard or drippings could be saved. Milk might come from a cow, a store, or not at all. Sausage could appear in tiny fragments. The result filled the stomach, and in labour economies built on extraction. That mattered to workers and bosses for very different reasons. For the worker, it meant making it to noon. For the boss, it meant keeping labour cheap. Same plate, different meaning. Think about that for a second. A breakfast can be comforting and exploitative at the same time. It can warm the body while serving an economy that wears the body down. That is the tension inside sawmill gravy. It is remembered fondly by many people because it fed fathers, grandfathers, mothers, cooks, crews, and families who had few better options. But it also belongs to a labour world where low wages, dangerous conditions, and company-controlled food systems were common. The skillet does not erase the ledger. In Appalachian coal camps, southern mill villages, timber camps, and railroad work sites, food often followed the logic of maximum calories for minimum cost. Beans, cornbread, salt pork, biscuits, gravy, molasses, coffee, potatoes, and preserved foods appeared again and again because they worked. They were not chosen by culinary committees. They were chosen by price, storage, habit, and need. Need is as underrated recipe writer. A boarding house cook or camp cook had to manage scale. Feeding 2 people is one kind of task. Feeding 20, 40, or 100 hungry workers before dawn is another. biscuits and gravy scaled beautifully. The dough could be mixed in great bowls. Biscuits could be cut quickly or patted into rough shapes. Gravy could be made in a deep pan or kettle. If lumps formed, hungry men still ate. If the biscuits were imperfect, gravy softened them. If the meat was scarce, pepper helped. It was forgiving food for unforgiving work. There is a reason this meal clung to places where labour was physical and wages were thin. The same basic formula made sense in farm kitchens, lumber camps, mine boarding houses, roadside cafes, and later diners. It crossed from private poverty into public eating because the infrastructure of work demanded it. Men away from home needed breakfast. Cooks needed affordable menus. Restaurants near highways and mills needed dishes that felt homemade without costing much. Biscuits and gravy fit. Then came memory, which is one of the most powerful seasonings in American food. The camp worker might remember the breakfast not as evidence of exploitation, but as the smell of morning, the warmth before cold work, the plate that kept him going. His children might remember it as what he requested on Sundays. Their children might order it in a diner and call it heritage. That is how poverty food changes costume. First, it is necessity. Then it is habit. Then it is identity. By the time sawmill gravy entered common regional language, biscuits and gravy had gathered many meanings. It could be cheap food, work food, camp food, family food, black food, white food, mountain food, farm food, diner food, or simply breakfast. It had no single owner because hardship had many addresses. Still, the sawmill version reminds you how directly the dish was tied to labour. Wood fell, blades screamed, men ate, gravy stretched. And as the South moved through war, emancipation, reconstruction, debt, croplines, and industrial pressure, the same logic that fed workers in camps would press even harder on families trying to survive at home. The classic was almost ready, but not because America had grown generous, because poverty had grown efficient. Poverty did not invent biscuits, and poverty did not invent gravy. But poverty fused them together with a force that fashion never could. That fusion became clearer after the Civil War, when the South entered a long period of ruin, hunger, debt, and social violence. The war had destroyed towns, railroads, farms, barns, livestock, tools, and savings. Confederate money became worthless. Families who had once measured themselves by land and enslaved labour faced a shattered economy. While formerly enslaved people entered freedom with extraordinary courage and almost no material compensation for generations of stolen work. 4 million people had been enslaved. 4 million. Emancipation ended legal slavery, but it did not end the struggle over labour, food, land, and survival. In the years after 1865, many black families wanted land of their own, because land meant control over labour, crops, food, and time. Without land, freedom could be trapped inside contracts written by other people. White landowners wanted a dependable labour force. Merchants wanted repayment. Local authorities often protected old power in new forms. Out of this came sharecropping, tenant farming, croplines, and debt systems that locked millions of people, black and white, into cycles of dependency. Here is the brutal mechanism. A farmer might rent land, buy seed, tools, food, and supplies on credit, then repay the debt after the harvest. But the merchant set the prices. The landowner controlled the terms. Cotton prices rose and fell beyond the farmer's control. Bad weather, insects, illness, or a poor crop could ruin the year. At settlement time, the account book might show that after months of labour. The family still owed money. Work all year. Harvest the crop. Remain in debt. Again. That is not failure of thrift. That is a trap. Food inside that trap had to be cheap, filling, and adaptable. Families raised hogs if they could. They grew corn, beans, sweet potatoes, greens, and small gardens when allowed. They bought flour, salt, coffee, molasses, and other staples from country stores, often on credit. Meat might be rationed carefully. Milk depended on whether a cow was available. Flour could be precious. But by the late 19th century, industrial milling and expanding rail networks helped make commercial flour more common than before. This is where biscuits and gravy gained power as a poverty meal. The ingredients did not ask for prosperity. Flour, fat, milk or water, salt, pepper, and a little sausage or bacon grease could produce a breakfast that felt larger than its cost. The biscuit provided bulk. The gravy provided warmth and flavour. Together, they made scarcity feel briefly manageable. This was not indulgence, it was damage control. Imagine a farm morning under those conditions. The house is awake while the sky is still grey. A woman moves before everyone else, because breakfast must exist before labour begins. There may be children to feed, animals to tend, water to bring, a fire to coax back to life, and a day of work waiting in the field. Flour spills softly into a bowl, lard cuts through it, buttermilk or water pulls it into dough, in the skillet. Yesterday's grease loosens as it warms, giving off that heavy smell of pork fat and smoke. Flour darkens in the grease, liquid hisses when it hits the pan, the spoon keeps moving. If the gravy is thin, it still counts. If the biscuits are heavy, they still count if everyone leaves full enough to work. Breakfast has done its job. That is the emotional foundation of the dish. It was never simply about flavour. It was about a cook trying to create enough. Enough for children. Enough for field hands. Enough for a husband leaving for a mill. Enough for herself, if anything remained. Enough to make the morning less cruel. And the dish crossed racial and class lines in complicated ways. Poor white families, black tenant farmers, formerly enslaved families, mill workers, miners, loggers, and rural labourers all made versions of cheap breads and gravies shaped by what they had. But shared ingredients did not mean shared conditions. Black families faced land theft, racial terror, disenfranchisement, exploitative contracts, and violence layered on top of poverty. Poor white farmers endured debt and hardship too, while often being drawn into a racial order that offered social status in place of economic justice. The same foods could sit on different tables and carry different histories. A biscuit can be shared, power may not be. That is one reason Southern food history resists easy nostalgia. You can love the dish and still tell the truth about the world that made it necessary. You can remember a grandmother's kitchen with tenderness and still recognize that many grandmothers cooked under pressure, with limited choices and little rest. Memory softens edges. History sharpens them again. Biscuits and gravy lived in that tension. The Civil War and Reconstruction did not simply leave people poor, they rearranged poverty. Plantation slavery gave way to new labour systems. Small farmers entered market dependency. Rural stores became creditors. Cotton remained king in too many places, even when it exhausted soil and trapped families in single crop risk. The boll weevil, arriving in the South near the end of the 19th century and spreading in the early 20th, deepened the crisis by devastating cotton crops across large parts of the region. Families already balanced on the edge found the edge moving beneath their feet. Food had to stretch even farther, so gravy thickened with flour became more than a recipe. It became a strategy. Biscuits made with cheaper commercial flour became more than bread. They became carriers of survival when sausage was available. It made the gravy festive when there was only grease, flour, and water. The meal could still happen. Not well, perhaps not richly, but enough to face the day. That word returns again and again. Enough. The American classic was formed by that word, not by abundance, but by the repeated effort to imitate abundance. A full plate did not mean a full pantry. A creamy gravy did not mean plenty of meat. A warm biscuit did not mean the household was safe, but for a few minutes at the table. The meal could quiet the body's alarm, it could give heat, it could give salt, it could give weight in the stomach, and sometimes weight in the stomach was mercy. By the early 20th century, biscuits and gravy had become recognizable across much of the South and parts of Appalachia as everyday food for people who worked hard and had little cash. It was not yet the national icon it would become. It was still close to its original purpose, still tied to field, mill mine, and home kitchen, but the pieces had locked together: cheap flour, saved fat, milk when possible, pepper for bite, a biscuit to catch it all. Poverty had taken ancient bread, old gravy, plantation skill, hog economy, chemical leavening, industrial flour, and debt, then pressed them into a single plate. That plate was soft, pale, warm, and plain-looking. Do not be fooled by plain-looking things. They often carry the most history. By the time biscuits and gravy settled into Southern breakfast, it was not one dish, it was a family argument. That is what makes it interesting. People say biscuits and gravy as if everyone means the same plate, but across the South, Appalachia, the Midwest, and border states, the phrase can point to different gravies, different fats, different memories, and different rules spoken with absolute confidence by people who learned them in childhood. Some insist the gravy must be white and peppery. Some expect sausage in it. Some grew up with milk gravy made from bacon grease. Some remember tomato gravy. Some prefer red-eye gravy, thin and sharp from coffee. Some want chocolate gravy, which sounds like dessert wandered into breakfast and refused to leave. Food traditions do that. They multiply. The most famous version today is sausage gravy, a pale, thick, pepper-speckled sauce made from breakfast sausage drippings, flour, and milk. The sausage is crumbled and browned in a skillet. Flour is stirred into the fat. Milk is added, and the whole thing thickens into a creamy blanket for split biscuits. It is rich without being refined, heavy without apology, and so tied to American breakfast that it can feel ancient. It is not ancient in that exact form. It depends on commercial flour, common milk access, ground breakfast sausage, black pepper, and quick biscuits that became easier through chemical leavening. It belongs most strongly to the 19th and 20th centuries, when the ingredients and habits aligned, but its instincts are older. Save fat, thicken liquid, stretch meat, soften bread, old logic, newer plate. That is often how food history works. The recipe appears modern. The hunger beneath it is old. Milk gravy is close kin. In many rural kitchens, the gravy did not need much sausage, or any sausage at all. Bacon grease, ham drippings, or plain lard could be heated with flour and thinned with milk. The result might be white, tan, smooth, lumpy, peppery, mild, rich, or barely there, depending on the household. A cook with a little extra milk could make it luxurious. A cook with very little could make it thin and still call everyone to breakfast. Nobody at the table needed a taxonomy. They needed food. Then there is red-eye gravy, a very different creature. It is usually associated with country ham, especially in the upland and southern table traditions where salty cured ham was fried in a skillet. Then the drippings were loosened with black coffee or sometimes water. The gravy is thin, brown, salty, and bitter-edged, not creamy. The name is often explained by the reddish circles of fat that can float in the pan, like an eye staring back at you. It is usually poured over ham, grits, rice, or biscuits. No flour, no milk, no soft white blanket, just salt, smoke, coffee, and nerve. A plate with red-eye gravy tastes like a morning after very little sleep. It is not trying to comfort you in the same way sausage gravy does. It wakes you up. It leans forward, if white gravy is a quilt. Red-eye gravy is a slap on the shoulder. Both belong to the same broad world of thrift, but they tell different stories. Sausage gravy is about stretching pork through flour and milk. Red-eye gravy is about extracting every last bit of cured ham flavour from a pan. One thickens scarcity. The other rinses it clean and pours it back. This is where regional identity enters the skillet. In parts of Appalachia, sawmill gravy could mean a sparse flour gravy connected to camps and mills. In parts of the Deep South, tomato gravy appeared when tomatoes were plentiful, combining pan drippings, flour, tomatoes, and seasoning into something bright, acidic, and practical in some households, especially in the South and lower Midwest. Chocolate gravy became a breakfast treat made from cocoa, sugar, flour, milk, and butter or fat. Served over biscuits, it is sweet, warm, and startling if you didn't grow up with it. But if you did grow up with it, the idea that it sounds strange may seem like someone doubting sunlight. That is the power of childhood food. It makes local logic feel universal. These variations also reveal class and access. A gravy made with plenty of sausage says one thing. A gravy made with only grease says another. A gravy made with fresh milk depends on dairy access. A gravy made with water tells you the pantry was thinner. Black pepper might be generous or scarce. Flour might be fine and white, or cheaper and coarser. Even the biscuit underneath could change. From delicate, soft wheat biscuits to rougher quick breads. From carefully cut rounds to hand-patted pieces baked close together. The dish was never frozen in one perfect form. It adapted because people had to adapt. Race shaped these traditions too, though not always in ways that fit clean categories. Black cooks, white cooks, indigenous communities, immigrant families, and mixed regional populations all worked with local ingredients and unequal systems. Some versions became coded as poor white food in public imagination, while others lived in black kitchens, church suppers, domestic work, railroad service, and restaurants without receiving the same recognition. Shared Southern ingredients did not mean identical experience, and a recipe crossing a boundary did not erase the boundary itself. You can see this especially in the way authority gets assigned. A white family cookbook might preserve a biscuit recipe without naming the black cook who perfected it. A diner menu might sell country gravy as old-fashioned without admitting how much of Southern food depended on coerced labour and underpaid domestic work. A nostalgic essay might treat the dish as simple heritage. When the heritage is tangled with hunger, race, land, credit, migration, and women's labour, the gravy is smooth. The history is not. And yet, tenderness exists inside that history too. It would be dishonest to say biscuits and gravy are only hardship. People loved them. People still love them. A child at a table didn't necessarily taste debt or labour systems. A child tasted pepper, warmth, milk, soft bread, and maybe the rare pleasure of seconds. A grandmother making gravy might be tired, but she might also be proud. A father coming home from a night shift might want exactly that plate, because it felt like proof he had reached morning. Food can carry pain and affection at once. That is not contradiction. That is memory. By the middle of the 20th century, the competing gravies had begun to settle into public forms. Restaurant menus favoured the version that could be easily reproduced biscuits with sausage gravy or country gravy. It was filling, inexpensive, and visually satisfying. Red-eye gravy remained regional. Tomato gravy stayed close to home kitchens and certain cafes. Chocolate gravy became beloved where it lived and baffling where it did not. The national imagination simplified the whole family into one plate. 2 biscuits, white gravy, black pepper, maybe sausage. That simplification helped the dish travel, but it also flattened it. Because behind the national icon are many gravies, each one shaped by what a household had, what a region grew, what labour demanded, and what memory chose to keep. So when you hear someone say there is only one real way to make biscuits and gravy, be gentle with them, then be suspicious. Because this dish was never about purity. It was about use. It was about making breakfast from the available world. Milk if you had it, water if you did not, sausage if possible, grease if not, coffee for ham, tomatoes in season, chocolate for children, celebration, or comfort. The classic was not born from one recipe card, it was born from improvisation. Once biscuits and gravy left the farm kitchen, they found a second home under fluorescent lights. That transition matters, because it changed the dish from private necessity into public comfort in the early 20th century. Americans were moving more than ever. They were leaving farms for mill towns, leaving the South for northern and western cities, driving new roads, riding buses, taking trains, and eating away from home with growing frequency. A breakfast that had once belonged to cabins, camps, smokehouses, and family tables began appearing in cafes, boarding houses, lunch counters, roadside diners, and truck stops. The plate travelled because the people travelled, and the people were travelling for complicated reasons. Some left because agriculture could no longer support them. Some left because boll weevil damage had wrecked cotton regions. Some left because mechanization reduced farm labour. Some left because racial violence made home dangerous. During the Great Migration, millions of black Southerners moved north, west, and Midwest in search of safety, wages, schools, and political possibility. Poor white Southerners also moved into textile towns, coal regions, factories, and cities. Food moved with them, but not always evenly, and not always with credit attached to the right hands. Biscuits and gravy followed those migrations in memory and appetite. At the same time, the American diner was taking shape. Diners grew out of lunch wagons and quick service eating places that served workers needing meals outside the home. By the 1920s and 1930s, diners, cafes, and roadside restaurants had become familiar parts of the American landscape, especially as automobiles changed how people travelled. A driver could stop for coffee, eggs, toast, ham, grits, pancakes, or a plate of biscuits under gravy. The meal that had once answered hunger before farm work now answered another hunger, the hunger of the road. Think about the sensory shift. The old kitchen smelled of wood smoke, lard, damp flour, and the family stove. The diner smelled of coffee, bacon grease, hot griddles, bleach water, cigarette smoke, and pie warming behind glass. Plates clattered. A bell rang from the service window. Someone turned a stool, a waitress, moving faster than anyone watching understood, refilled a cup before the customer asked. The gravy came from a steam table or a heavy pot near the range. It was thick enough to sit on the biscuit like weather. Not elegant, reliable, that was its charm. Restaurants loved biscuits and gravy for the same reasons poor households had loved them. The ingredients were cheap, the dish was filling, it used familiar techniques, it could be held warm, it could be served quickly. It made customers feel they had received something substantial, even when the restaurant's cost was low. That is a rare and powerful restaurant equation inexpensive to make. Emotionally valuable to receive. A plate of biscuits and gravy could say home even to someone who had not lived at home for years. Here is where nostalgia begins doing real work. By the mid-20th century, as more Americans left rural life behind, the foods of rural poverty started to change meaning. What had once marked lack could be reimagined as authenticity, Cornbread, beans, greens, salt pork, fried chicken, grits, and biscuits all became wrapped in language of tradition, simplicity, and home. Some of that nostalgia was sincere, some of it was selective, some of it was sold back to people by restaurants. Advertisers and tourist economies, poverty became atmosphere, a dangerous trick. Because when a diner menu called something country style, it usually meant warmth, abundance, and memory. It didn't usually mean croplines, company stores, racial terror, domestic exhaustion, or workers eating fast before dangerous shifts. The phrase softened the past. That does not mean the food was fake. It means the story around it was edited. You see this clearly in highway culture after World War II. Road travel expanded dramatically. Families took vacations by car. Trucking grew. Interstate highways reshaped movement. Roadside restaurants learned to promise regional identity in edible form. In the South, and along routes carrying southern migrants, biscuits and gravy became part of a breakfast vocabulary that felt rooted, affordable, and generous. A traveller could sit down far from home and order something that seemed to know them. That emotional promise was powerful. If you were a truck driver starting before dawn, biscuits and gravy gave weight and warmth. If you were a family passing through Tennessee or Kentucky or Missouri, it offered a taste of place. If you were a migrant who had left the South, the dish could call back mornings you missed, or mornings you were glad to have escaped, or both at once. Food rarely asks permission before carrying mixed feelings. It just does. Church suppers, community breakfasts, fundraisers, and school cafeterias also helped carry the dish forward. Biscuits could be made in trays, gravy could be made in vats. Volunteers could feed a crowd without expensive ingredients. The meal was communal by nature because it scaled so well. A church basement serving biscuits and gravy did not need luxury to create fellowship. It needed flour, sausage, milk, coffee, folding chairs, and people willing to show up early. And people did. This is the part that does not get enough credit. The public life of biscuits and gravy depended heavily on women's labour, much of it underpaid or unpaid. Waitresses, cooks, church volunteers, cafeteria workers, mothers, grandmothers, and domestic workers kept the dish alive. They mixed, stirred, carried, served, wiped, washed, and came back the next morning. The meal became nostalgic partly because someone else kept doing the work required to make nostalgia taste warm. That work was often invisible. The plate was not. By the late 20th century, biscuits and gravy had crossed from regional food into national shorthand. It signalled southernness, rural identity, blue-collar appetite, diner authenticity, and old-fashioned breakfast. It appeared on menus far outside the South, sometimes lovingly, sometimes badly. The gravy could be too thick, too bland, too floury, or poured over biscuits that had never known tenderness in their brief and disappointing lives. But even a bad version proved something. The idea had travelled, it had become recognisable. Recognition is a kind of victory, though not always a clean one. As biscuits and gravy entered American popular culture, the dish was simplified again, southern, hearty, homemade, old-time, cheap, comforting, all true, partly, all incomplete. Underneath the comfort remained the older story of hunger, labour, race, migration, chemistry, and pork fat saved because nobody could afford to waste it. Still, when a tired traveller sat at a counter and the plate arrived steaming, history did not announce itself. The customer saw breakfast, the biscuits softened, the gravy spread, pepper rose in the steam, outside, trucks rolled past, headlights pale in the morning. The dish had left the cabin, it had joined the road. Industrial food did not destroy biscuits and gravy. It put them in a package. That change began slowly, then all at once. The same dish that had once required a practiced hand, a hot stove, saved grease, and a morning's careful timing entered the age of cans, boxes, plastic wrap, freezer cases, drive-through windows, and refrigerated dough that popped open with a sound memorable enough to startle the dog. A meal built from thrift became a product line. A plate born from scarcity became inventory. And this is where the story gets very American. For much of the 20th century, food companies promised homemakers the one thing kitchens had always consumed without mercy: time. Canned biscuits, biscuit mixes, packaged sausage, condensed milk, evaporated milk, frozen breakfasts, instant gravy packets, and pre-made restaurant components all belong to a wider transformation in American eating. After World War II, more households gained refrigerators, electric ovens, gas ranges, supermarkets, and access to national brands. Women were increasingly expected to manage paid work, domestic labour, childcare, social life, and the emotional theatre of home. Food advertising stepped into that pressure and offered help, though often with a smile so bright it could hide the trap. Convenience did not end kitchen labour, it reorganised it. Refrigerated biscuit dough became one of the clearest symbols of that shift. Instead of cutting fat into flour, judging moisture by touch, patting dough, and hoping the oven ran true, a cook could open a tube, separate rounds of dough, place them on a pan, and bake. The biscuit lost some mystery but gained speed. It became dependable in a new way, not dependable like hardtack surviving a voyage. Dependable like a weeknight product that would behave almost the same every time. That mattered to millions of households. The most famous refrigerated dough brand, Pillsbury, turned the biscuit into something both domestic and corporate. The Pillsbury Doughboy appeared in the 1960s, soft, pale, giggling, and impossible to mistake for a coal camp breakfast. He was charming. He was also a mascot for the industrialization of home baking, flour, leavening, fat, packaging, refrigeration, branding. And advertising had all been folded into one cheerful little figure who lived on television. A poverty food now had a marketing department. Think about that for a second. The gravy changed too. Packaged country gravy mixes allowed cooks to add water or milk and produce a thick white sauce with pepper flavour in minutes. Restaurants could buy prepared mixes, frozen biscuits, pre-cooked sausage, and standardised bases. Cafeterias and fast food kitchens could serve biscuits and gravy without relying on one cook's inherited touch. Consistency became the new skill. The question was no longer, can your hands feel the dough? The question was, can the supply chain deliver the same result in 500 locations? This was not just a food change, it was a business model. Fast food chains understood the appeal. Breakfast became one of the major battlegrounds of American quick service in the late 20th century. And biscuits were perfect for it. They felt regional, hearty, and handmade. Even when they had been engineered for speed and replication, chains across the South and beyond added biscuit sandwiches, sausage biscuits, chicken biscuits, and biscuits with gravy for a commuter, construction worker, nurse, truck driver, or student. The old formula returned in a new wrapper: warm starch, pork flavour, salt, speed. The drive-through replaced the hearth, but the need for a fast, filling morning did not disappear. That is the twist. Industrialization made biscuits and gravy less local, less handmade, and sometimes less good. But it also made them more available. A person who did not know how to make scratch biscuits could still eat them. A family without time could still serve something close to the memory. A diner could keep gravy hot all morning. A chain could sell a version to someone hundreds of miles from Appalachia or Alabama. The dish became portable again, just as its ancient biscuit ancestors had been portable, although now the journey happened through trucks, freezers, and distribution centres. History likes circles, some of them come shrink-wrapped. The economics were powerful, flour remained cheap, sausage trimmings and seasoned pork products could be manufactured at scale. Powdered gravy mixes use starches, dairy solids, fats, flavourings, salt, and pepper to imitate the old skillet process. Frozen biscuits could be produced in enormous batches, waste could be reduced, portions could be controlled, labour could be trained down to steps. The very qualities that made the dish useful in poverty made it useful in food service. Stretchable, stable, familiar, profitable. But something was lost when the skillet disappeared. Scratch biscuits carry the marks of hands. They vary with humidity, flour, fat, and mood. Gravy made from real drippings carries the exact history of what cooked before it. Packaged versions flatten those differences. They make memory repeatable, but not always alive. They can deliver comfort while removing the little accidents that made a household's version distinct. One grandmother's gravy is not the same as another's. A packet wants them to be. Still, it would be too easy to sneer at convenience. That is usually a mistake. Packaged food often entered homes because people were tired, busy, poor, or constrained. A canned biscuit might not satisfy a purist, but it could help a working parent put something warm on the table. A gravy mix might not honour the smokehouse, but it could feed children before school. Convenience is not always laziness. Sometimes it is survival wearing a barcode. And biscuits and gravy have always belonged to survival. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the dish had become both nostalgic and commercial. It appeared in frozen breakfast bowls, microwave trays, gas station warmers, hotel breakfast buffets, school cafeterias, military dining halls, diners, fast food counters, and brunch menus. It could be sold for a few dollars beside a highway, or dressed up with heritage pork sausage and local cream for a price that would have made a sharecropper stare silently into the middle distance. The irony is almost too neat. Almost. The same meal that stretched scraps now sells authenticity. The same gravy once made from grease and flour now appears in glossy photographs. The same biscuit once baked by women with little rest now arrives from a factory line with nutritional labelling, allergen warnings, and instructions in 3 languages. But do not dismiss it too quickly. Industrial food did not erase the old dish. It exposed how powerful the old dish had become. Companies do not package foods nobody recognizes. Chains do not sell memories that nobody has. The existence of instant country gravy proves that somewhere deep in the American imagination. A peppered white sauce over biscuit still means warmth, fullness, and home. Even when home is a drive-through lane. Even when breakfast comes from a freezer. Even when the biscuit pops out of a can. Once biscuits and gravy became nostalgic, they also became debatable. That is almost inevitable. The moment a food becomes a symbol, people start guarding it. They argue over what counts as real, what counts as ruined, what belongs on the plate, and who has the authority to decide. Biscuits and gravy. A dish born from improvisation now attracts rules. The gravy must be sausage gravy. The biscuit must be buttermilk. The pepper must be visible. The sausage must be loose, not sliced. The biscuit must split naturally, not crumble like dry plaster. Someone, somewhere, is always ready to declare breakfast invalid. This is funny until you remember the deeper point. Authenticity is often a luxury created after necessity has passed. Poor cooks made biscuits and gravy with what they had. Modern eaters sometimes demand that it be made with what they imagine the past always had. Those are not the same thing. The old dish could use milk or water, sausage or bacon grease, lard or shortening, soft flour or whatever flour was available. It could be thick, thin, pale, peppery, plain, smooth, lumpy, careful, rushed, rich, or barely holding together. Its genius was not purity. Its genius was adaptability. That adaptability is exactly why the dish survived into the modern era. Chefs began reworking it in restaurants that treated Southern food as worthy of serious attention rather than condescension. Some used freshly milled flour, cultured buttermilk, leaf lard, local pork, cracked pepper, and carefully built sausage gravy. Some added herbs, hot sauce, mushrooms, chicken, fried eggs, or smoked meats. Some served biscuits with reddijan, tomato gravy, or rich brown gravies closer to French technique than country breakfast. In the wrong hands, this can become costume. In the right hands, it can become respect. The difference is whether the cook understands the dish's history, not just aesthetic. A tall biscuit and a ladle of gravy are not automatically Southern because they look charming on a ceramic plate. They become meaningful when the cook understands flour, fat, labour, land, race, poverty, migration, and memory. Without that, biscuits and gravy can be reduced to rustic decor. With it, the dish can speak softly and still say a great deal. At the same time, home cooks kept doing what home cooks have always done. They adapted. Some used canned biscuits because time was short. Some used gluten-free flour because wheat was no longer possible. Some used turkey sausage for health reasons. Some used plant-based milk and mushrooms to build a vegetarian gravy that still followed the old logic of browning, thickening, seasoning, and stretching flavour. Some made vegan versions with oil, flour, oat milk, nutritional yeast, black pepper, and deeply browned onions or mushroom. Now, if you grew up with pork drippings, this may sound like heresy, but look closer. A mushroom gravy over biscuits is not the same dish in flavour, and it should not pretend to be. But it uses the same structure, cheap base, savoury fat, thickened liquid, warm bread, comfort, and the transformation of modest ingredients into fullness. The body has changed. The skeleton is familiar. Food traditions survive partly because they can bend without breaking. That bending has become more visible as American eating habits have changed. Concerns about saturated fat, sodium, processed meat, and heavy breakfasts have made biscuits and gravy feel indulgent rather than ordinary for many people. A plate can be high in calories, salt, and fat, especially in restaurant portions that turn a labourer's fuel into a weekend challenge. What once made sense before a day of fieldwork can feel different before a day of email. Context changes appetite. A logger's breakfast and a desk worker's brunch are not asking the body the same question. This does not mean the dish is bad. It means the dish has migrated again, from fuel to memory, from daily necessity to occasional comfort. You may eat it because you miss someone. You may eat it because you are travelling. You may eat it because rain is hitting the window and the morning feels like it needs weight. You may eat it because peppered gravy over a soft biscuit answers some ancient animal request for warmth and salt. That request is older than nutrition labels. Modern restaurants also use biscuits and gravy to talk about region. In cities far from the south, the dish can signal craft, nostalgia, or a particular idea of Americana. Sometimes this is done thoughtfully. Sometimes it becomes a cartoon. A menu might call something Southern because it contains a biscuit, bourbon, and a mason jar, which is roughly the culinary equivalent of wearing a cowboy hat in an airport and claiming to be a ranch. Still, the renewed attention has had benefits. It has helped recover stories that were once ignored. Writers, cooks, and researchers have pushed harder to credit black cooks, domestic workers, working-class women, indigenous influence on Southern grain traditions, and the economic systems that shaped so-called comfort food. Biscuits and gravy are no longer only discussed as a charming breakfast. They can also be discussed as evidence of survival, evidence of erasure, evidence of skill, evidence of how poor food becomes national identity. That last part is important, because biscuits and gravy are not alone. Many celebrated foods began as ways to stretch scarcity gumbo. Polenta, ramen, congee, cassoulet, beans and rice, migas, shepherd's pie, panzanella, and countless stews, porridges, and breads. The pattern repeats across the world. People take scraps, starch, fat, liquid, and time, then create something that later generations call tradition. At first, it is necessity. Later, it becomes cuisine. And sometimes, after that, it becomes expensive. The brunch version of biscuits and gravy, with house-made sausage, artisan flour, cultured butter, and a price that could once have bought several pounds of staple food, is not merely hypocrisy. It is the full arc of poverty cuisine in miniature. The dish rises from lack, gains memory, becomes regional identity, enters restaurants, becomes craft, and returns to the table wearing a nicer shirt. Not bad for flour and grease, but the best modern versions, whether humble or elevated. Remember the original promise. A biscuit should be tender enough to receive. A gravy should be generous enough to cover. The plate should feel like someone wanted you to leave the table steadier than you arrived. That is the quiet, emotional truth of the dish, and no amount of reinvention should lose it. Because after all the arguments, all the menus, all the frozen trays, all the vegan versions, all the purist scolding, and all the brunch inflation, biscuits and gravy remain what they have always been at heart, a way to make the morning bearable. By the time biscuits and gravy reached the modern American table, they had already lived several lives. They had been a survival technology before anyone called them comfort food. They had belonged to grain fields, smokehouses, plantation kitchens, logging camps, farm cabins, church basements, diners, factory lines, and drive-through lanes. They had been cooked by enslaved women whose names were often erased, by poor mothers stretching breakfast before dawn, by camp cooks feeding exhausted crews, by waitresses carrying plates through cigarette smoke, by home cooks opening cans after long shifts, and by chefs trying to recover dignity in foods once dismissed as plain. That is a lot of history for something that looks so soft, and that softness is part of the trick. Biscuits and gravy do not announce themselves like a monument. They do not look dramatic. No crown, no sword, no treaty table, no battlefield. Just pale bread, pale gravy, black pepper, maybe sausage, steam rising quietly from a plate. But ordinary foods often carry the deepest evidence, because ordinary foods are where history enters the body most often. You do not eat a constitution every morning, you eat breakfast, and breakfast remembers. It remembers the ancient problem of grain. How do you make seeds feed people beyond the day they are harvested? It remembers the hard biscuit baked for storage, carried by soldiers and sailors, dipped and softened because survival mattered more than pleasure. It remembers the pan drippings of older kitchens, where fat could not be wasted and flavour had to be rescued from the bottom of a skillet. It remembers wheat crossing the Atlantic, only to discover that American soil, climate, and class would change its meaning. It remembers corn country. It remembers status. It remembers the old southern table where a fine white flour signalled access, while cornmeal fed the many. It remembers enslaved cooks working in heat, smoke, danger, and coercion, creating and preserving culinary knowledge that later generations too often renamed as simple tradition. It remembers hogs in the woods, butcher days in the cold, smokehouses full or empty, lard cooling in jars, and families measuring security by what could last through winter. It remembers chemistry too, because even comfort food has a laboratory hidden inside it. Baking soda, buttermilk, baking powder, roller mills, soft wheat flour, national brands, paper sacks, and advertising all help turn biscuits from labour-heavy, special breads into quick breads that ordinary households could make more often. A biscuit rose because carbon dioxide formed inside the dough. A family rose from the table because the biscuit gave them enough strength to move into the day. Small bubbles, large consequences. Then came the camps and mills, where sawmill gravy fed bodies treated as expendable by industries hungry for timber. Coal, rails, cloth, and profit. The gravy stretched meat flavour across flour because workers needed calories and employers wanted low costs. It was warmth before danger. It was salt before exhaustion. It was a full stomach inside an unfair bargain. Then came debt. Reconstruction, sharecropping, cropliens, tenancy, racial violence, and rural hardship pressed the South into new forms of poverty after slavery formally ended. Biscuits and gravy became one answer among many to the daily pressure of feeding people cheaply. It was not a perfect answer. It did not end hunger. It did not end exploitation. But it could make a morning possible. That matters. A morning possible is not nothing. The 20th century carried the dish outward. Diners served it to travellers. Truck stops served it before sunrise. Churches served it in fellowship halls. Cafeterias served it in lines. Families carried it through migration, memory, and habit. Then factories and fast food chains learned what poor kitchens had known all along: flour, fat, salt, pork flavour, and warmth are powerful. They put biscuits in cans, gravy in packets, breakfast in freezers, and country flavour into a business plan. The old meal didn't vanish. It changed clothes. Today, biscuits and gravy can mean many things at once. It can be a cheap plate at a small-town cafe. It can be a frozen breakfast tray eaten before work. It can be a brunch dish made with heritage pork and cultured butter. It can be vegan mushroom gravy over gluten-free biscuits. It can be a grandmother's recipe, a diner habit, a road trip ritual, a hangover cure, a memory of poverty, or a meal someone loves without knowing any of this history at all. That is allowed. Food does not require you to know its whole story before it feeds you, but knowing the story changes the taste. It makes the biscuit heavier in the mind. Even as it stays light in the hand, it makes the gravy less blank. You can see the flour barrel, the smokehouse, the iron skillet, the camp table, the country store ledger, the church kitchen, the waitress's tired feet, the factory conveyor belt, and the modern plate in front of you. You can see how America turns scarcity into identity, then identity into nostalgia, then nostalgia into commerce, and you can also see something more tender than that. People kept feeding one another under pressure, under injustice, under debt, under exhaustion, under conditions nobody should romanticize. People still made breakfast. They warmed skillets, they saved grease, they measured by touch, they stirred until the lumps disappeared, or did not disappear, and served it anyway. They made enough when enough was hard to find. It was there when grain first became survival food. It was there when empires marched on dry bread. It was there when pan drippings were too valuable to waste. It was there when wheat became status and corn became daily life. It was there when enslaved cooks laboured in heat and danger. It was there when hog fat meant winter security. It was there when chemistry made quick bread rise. It was there when saw blades screamed through southern timber. It was there when debt trapped farmers in fields they did not own. It was there when diners opened before dawn, when highways filled with headlights, when factories packaged memory, and when modern cooks began asking what authenticity really means. And now it is here, maybe on a plate in front of you, maybe in memory, maybe in a diner you passed once on a rainy morning, where the coffee was too hot, the gravy too thick, and the biscuit exactly what you needed. A food made from scraps became a classic because it answered one of the oldest human needs with almost embarrassing simplicity. Warm bread, hot gravy, enough. Not bad for flour, fat, milk, pepper, and poverty. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and subscribe, like the video. And tell me in the comments which part of this history surprised you most. There are many more everyday foods with strange, difficult, and beautiful pasts waiting for us, and I will see you in the next one.